That's okay? Okay. I am just getting over a cold, so I'm a little more gravelly than I usually am. But thank you for the invitation to come. It's always been kind of a joy to come here, kind of keeping with my great-grandfather and my grandfather, and I think my great-uncle Peter Repp was also here a number of times long ago, so always good to be here. Thank you for the music. For me, worship starts when the piano starts at the beginning of the service, and I was also kind of always humming along to the music even when I don't know all the words. And Tessa, thank you for the children's story. I could actually sit down now without saying anything because you covered it pretty well. In the bulletin are a bunch of questions that you might want to take with you after this sermon. If you had an adult Sunday school, those are kinds of things that questions I'd be raising to those people in the discussion. So if you want to roast the preacher afterwards, that might be things that you could use to do that with. So would you pray with me, please? Lord, what we're asking for here today is that what I say and the meditations of our hearts and our thinking would be honorable to you and your presence in our lives. Amen. So it always surprises me that prairie people are so enamored of hills and mountains. How many, especially like in my grandparents' house, there was a picture of a mountain someplace. Really prairie people. Maybe it's that we have so little landscape drama ourselves. Every little bump and coulee and poplar bluff gets its disproportionate notice. Even a spiritual significance. Connie Calder, who some of you might know is our most prairie singer-songwriter, says in our hymn for Pincher Creek, I look to the hills from whence cometh salvation, I find strength in their quiet roll. When I feel myself troubled, I look to those hills, and the quiet green quiets my soul. Oh, I'll never leave my hills of salvation. No, you'll never get me to roam. And it's not that the hills around Pincher Creek, Alberta, are insignificant. It's true that every small bit of prairie advantage has been used for millennia. Now they're ideal spots to find arrowheads and flint chips where pre-European Aboriginal scouts watched for buffalo and enemy and chipped their elegant stone tools. After all, merely standing up on the prairie, as the Corner Gas theme music says, you can see your dog running away for 3 days. And I was coming up on the drive here, of course, it's pretty flat here. In her secular hymn, Calder uses much biblical imagery, especially from the Psalms, where God is in the mountains or above the mountains. And the Bible's not unique in that. Other ancient plains people also had their hills and mountain imagery. Babel built a tower. Babylon built ziggurats. Egypt and Aztecs had pyramids. Mountain people like the Greeks had Olympus, and the Norse Valhalla, and the Inca had mountain shrines to Apu and the sun god. In unfaithful Israel, every hill had its Ashtaroth or Baal shrine. Even Christians build soaring cathedrals and churches mountain style. And Muslim mosques require a heaven-reaching minaret from which the Muezzin calls the call to prayer 5 times a day. Getting closer to the gods meant getting off the plane of the ordinary and climbing closer to the sky. Maybe it was in that thinner space, that thin air, that the gods' Shekinah glory could most dramatically flame out. It's no wonder that the mountain became a metaphor for an intense spiritual experience. I could pun and say heightened experience. The mountaintop experience label has been tagged onto times at camp and at conference, to miraculous healing or to a revelatory insight or the nature of the divine. You've all heard stories of powerful witness, missionary lives, dramatic conversions, friends speaking of their own personal times when God has seemed especially close. For me, I can remember going to the Mennonite World Conference in 2015 in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. My goodness, 6,000 Mennonites from all over the world singing 606. You know, that praise God thing. Blew the roof off of that arena. And doing that in a dozen different languages. Amazing. Yet for all their power, those Shekinah on the mountaintop experiences seem to have remarkably short-lived effect on people's lives. Look at Israel. Before Sinai, that was just read, Israel had already lived through a number of intensely close interactions with God acting for them. 10 dramatic plagues, including Passover, and a rescue from Egypt's slave pits. Yet they complain merely a day into the desert. They have the pillar of fire and the column of smoke. They walked through sea on dry ground. They've had sweet water from a rock, manna in a wasteland, yet Israel is in a constant state of sucking wine. Our Exodus text is part of the story of Israel's most dramatic and pivotal God on a mountaintop experience. It comes just after Moses and the elders have confirmed their acceptance of God's covenant with a banquet at the foot of Sinai Mountain, in God's presence. We will follow the Lord, the elders and Israel say. Okay, Moses says. Eating's done. Go back with Aaron and Hur to the camps on the plain. Together, you lot can take care of any problems that come up. I've got God business on the mountain. And Moses beckons to Joshua, and they head for the top of Sinai for a 40-day camp out with God. And God writing on stones. Moses got the face-to-face with God, the certainty of the spiritual purpose, the clarity and the glory. He got to know where Israel was going. What about the rest of Israel? Eventually, Moses comes down, shiny-faced, looking scarily cool and holy. The rest of Israel had been sweating it out in the get up and go to work, in the gotta pay your taxes, in the gotta get the kids fed and go to school, of the everyday of 40 days in the heat of the plain, apprehensively wondered what all that cloud and lightning and shaking on the mountaintop was all about. Well, we know what happened. It's hard down on the plain. 40 days is a long time. And Israel, like us, needed the constant reassurance of golden calf gods with them. So Aaron gave them a God who could not shake mountains and would not shake them. A God who was always visibly with them. It couldn't move. A God whose image they made, not a God who demanded they conform to his image. In a parallel story from Matthew, Jesus takes Peter, James, and John up the mountain of transfiguration. Why those three? What about the other 9? What about us left below? But up the mountain the quartet goes. And like Moses centuries before, Jesus glows like the sun as he talks with Moses and Elijah. Impulsive Peter knows the Moses story and figures, hey, this is wonderful. Maybe he thinks it's going to be 40 days of camping out with God and Moses and Elijah. And then comes God's terrifying voice, slamming them to the ground with its command to listen to Jesus, and the experience is over. Now, unlike Moses leaving Israel on the plain to climb his desert mountain, the 9 disciples left on the plain might not have known about the mountaintop experience, didn't even get to hear about the Elijah discussion on the way down until long after the resurrection. But like Moses and Joshua returning to the plain, to the sin-filled distractions and sweaty irritations of the Hebrew camp on the plain, Jesus and his 3 companions return to life as before. The other 9 needing their questioning looks answered, wanting an explanation. The crowd's needy hands out wanting bread and healing. The scribes and the Pharisees' doubting voices wanting controversy. And all of it, just as it was before they went up. Still waiting for Jesus on his crossword way. That's the problem with mountaintop experiences. You've got to come down. You can't live on the mountaintop. Even if you've got God in a cloud, even if you're Jesus. Even if you come down shiny-faced and inspired. So what's with all those mountaintop experiences? Certainly, for the participants, they were wonderful. They gave Moses and Jesus a sure vision, a sure sense of the direction ahead. Moses came down with the laws and regulations of Torah that organized Hebrew life around the worship of their God. It confirmed his ministry. Jesus, in conversation with 2 great Hebrew leaders, had his crossword way validated, confirmed, and his ministry affirmed. For both Moses and Jesus, their authority was irrefutably validated by God's terrifying voice from the cloud. They had gone a step beyond faith. What the letter to the Hebrews describes as sure of what we hope. They had the muscularly certain presence of God with them. Perhaps you have your own personal stories of your more recent mountaintop experiences, probably a whole less dramatic than shaking mountains or Elijah times, but where you came out affirmed, sure of your relationship with your Lord. They are wonderful. But how long do they last? How long did the glow, the energy, the certainty last? What happened when you came down? What about the rest? Israel waiting at the bottom of Sinai. Or the other 9 disciples and the crowd waiting below on the mountain of transfiguration. What about the cranky rest of us in Carrot River who didn't get to climb up your mountain? A number of years ago, a friend of mine who I taught with had been attending evangelistic meetings at the Estevan Alliance Church. In the hallways between classes, we talked about the meetings and especially the dramatic witness stories, conversion stories that he had heard. He wanted badly to believe, but said what he really needed was for God to tap him on the shoulder. He asked me when God had tapped me on the shoulder. How did I know for sure? But conversion stories of Hell's Angels bikers or cancer cures have never been convincing for me. I want to hear from those who didn't get to go up the mountain, from the other bikers, from the loved ones of the cancer victim in the next bed who had died. In the early spring of our second year in Jordan, we were with MCC in Jordan for 3 years. The French teacher at my school came to the staff room one Monday with an incredible story. His brother was a Greek Orthodox priest. On Sunday, he had taken the bread brought by the congregation members for communion behind the icon screen. If any of you have been in a Greek Orthodox church, across the front here would be a kind of stasis, it's called, with a whole number of icons, and the altar would be behind that. So the priest had taken the bread that the congregation had brought for communion and taken it behind the icon screen for the blessing. And then he would be a 10-second thing, and he was supposed to then come out and distribute the bread for communion. He was taking an awfully long time for this 10-second ritual. He had come out from behind the iconostasis, pale, shaking, the icon tray with the bread on it, dripping with blood. The teachers in the staff room looked at the storyteller incredulous. A miracle? What? My storyteller continued that his brother was devout and sincere. The planning and deception that would be needed to pull off a trick like this was quite beyond him. Next Sunday, the Amman church was filled with visitors, including me and Merrill Morrow, the pastor of the international church we attended, and the senior Orthodox bishop who had come from Jerusalem, who declared the event a miracle. The congregation just buzzed with joy. People there seemed to expand. On our way home, Merrill and I discussed what had happened. For the congregation, at least, it was a mountaintop experience, a wonderful God tap on the shoulder. About a year earlier, Merrill had had a conversation with an Egyptian Coptic bishop who had told him that miracles encouraged and strengthened the minority church. They were vital, he said, to convince the Muslim majority that the power of the Christian God was awesome. The bishop had gone on to say that in the West, you guys don't need miracles. Here they're vital. So, would those revival meeting testimonies keep your witness faithful? Would blood flowing, and I have a picture of it here, you can look at later. Would blood flowing from a communion tray count as a tap on the shoulder? Or are you, like most postmodern citizens of the Western world, far too skeptical? Certainly for a time, Israel's children seemed enthusiastically to affirm the covenant. But as Moses takes too long on the mountain, their commitment falters. In the epistle reading from Peter, he tells of his own mountaintop experience. As a point of authenticity, he says, I was there. We heard God's voice, he says. We were there with Jesus. And certainly that congregation of the Greek Orthodox Church in Amman, Jordan, went to their homes surrounded by their Muslim neighbors, confident that God was with them. But for myself, I'd be interested in hearing the witness of some ordinary Hebrew family who sweltered in the hot tents and didn't worship that gold calf. Or from the 9 disciples who were left behind to deal with the demon-possessed child and the clamoring crowd, or, for some member of that Amman Orthodox congregation living with that experience 6 months later, or for that matter, you in Carrot River on Saskatchewan's plain prairie. How have you created and lived faithful lives on Saskatchewan's plain? Hiding away in their upper room after the crucifixion, the fear-filled disciples met Jesus. Like me, absent Thomas says, I'm not believing until my finger's in the spear holes. And of course, at the next meeting, Jesus invites Thomas to do just that. But he says, because you've seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe. I'm with Jesus on this. I'm more interested in those who, unlike Thomas, don't get to have breakfast with Jesus and still live lives, the consistent witness which resists the golden calves, especially the shiny golden ones, the gods that don't ask us to take up our cross. I'm more interested in those who don't get to go up the mountain, or if they do, come down to humble lives of persistent, consistent witness. In Harper Lee's story, To Kill a Mockingbird, Miss Maudie describes the character of Atticus Finch to his daughter as one who is the same in his house as he is on the streets. That is, one who can be trusted to do the right thing when no one else would. If you know the story, Atticus mounts a defense of a black man in an unfair rape trial in 1930s Alabama. At its opposite, I recently refed a basketball game. I do that as a sideline, where one coach was very public with his Christianity. His behavior during the game was no match for his words. After the game, my fellow ref commented, if I wasn't already a believer, his behavior wouldn't convince me. So, Carrot River, this is a long way of saying congratulations for many years of working out what it means to live down from the mountain, of having your public behavior match your pulpit words, of working out answers to that central Anabaptist question, how then shall we live? How then shall we live? You're still here. Maybe singing, I look to the plains from whence cometh salvation, doesn't sound quite the right note. But it is, after all, here on the plains that living happens. As wonderful as that glory time on the mountain is, it is, after all, limited in numbers. There's not much room up there. It doesn't happen every day, and it doesn't last very long, and after the mountaintop, you gotta come down. And prairie people, you know, mountains only get in the way. What a relief it is when you come out past Banff into past Canmore, and golly, suddenly you can see again. Even 3 days away. Down from the mountain, we deal with people, frustrating, frightened, demanding, confused, irritating people, yet loved by God. People see us, see our hypocrisy, see our golden calves, or maybe, hopefully, are lives of persistent, consistent witness. The church gets cleaned, bulletins gets printed, bills are paid, person to person has enough volunteers. MDS builds homes. The food grains bank fields are harvested. We walk the path with First Nations and a host of small acts of faithfulness and love through which the world sees Jesus in us. And it's in the mud and the dust of the plains that the work gets done. Food is grown, where in the sweat and cold people are fed. Kids' programs are planned, camps are supported, sermons are written, worship is planned. Neighbors are invited, desserts are eaten, and God's reconciling good news is lived out in our jobs, in the curling rink, at the town's coffee row, with our neighbors, whoever and wherever they are. Glorious and energizing as it is to climb God's mountain and hear God's voice, we can't live up there. God's yes, people no. Even Moses, even Jesus came down to the rest of us, to the humdrum of everyday get up and go to work life that everybody could see. It's not the mountaintop examples, as important as they are, that change people. It's the persistent, consistent, plain lives which witness to a God who transforms us. It's here where everyone can see that we serve our God who continually changes us to the image of Jesus, who walks with us in the everyday dust of our plains. Amen. Amen.